I'd like to announce a couple of things. First of all, we're getting very close to the end of the semester, only a couple more topics to cover, evolution today and climate change on Wednesday. I've just submitted an assignment for you, which is due on December 4th. That's a Saturday. And the assignment is to submit questions that you have, in particular on the topics that we haven't covered yet that will be covered on test 3. And test 3 will be a week from Wednesday, December 8th. So the topics to focus on are molecular genetics, enzymes, energy, photosynthesis, respiration, evolution, and climate change. However, I encourage you to, in reviewing your materials to get ready for the final exam, you can submit any question or issue that you'd like to see discussed on any topic that we've covered this semester. And we will have a discussion a week from today. Okay, so that's on your desk for you to do. And I would like to proceed with the topic today. Do you see natural selection and evolution?
Yes.
You do, okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'm trying to make it bigger. Let me see. Okay, now it should be large.
Yes,
Natural-
it is.
You see it as a large, your entire screen? Okay.
Yes,
Natural selection and evolution are basic to our understanding of life on the planet, where it came from and how it got to be the way we find it now. So these two processes have determined life forms since the beginning of life, and they're continuing right now, and they'll continue into the future. So what are they? Well, natural selection is differential survival and reproduction of individuals due to differences in phenotype. So natural selection requires variation. You know where variation comes from. Mutation, recombination, random assortment, random fertilization of eggs. And natural selection requires overproduction. So there has to be an excess population for natural selection to choose from in order to identify the fittest. And all those who are not the fittest will die. So that's natural selection. Evolution is inherited change in a population, not individuals, but inherited change in a population over successive generation. It results in the appearance of new forms. So the environment on the planet is constantly changing, and these changes create new niches in which life forms can occupy. And so each niche is occupied by life forms that are specifically adapted to that niche. And now to introduce you further I would like to show you a video. Do you see stated clearly?
Yes.
Okay, then I'll play it.
What is natural selection? Natural selection is one of several key concepts contained within the theory of evolution. To understand exactly what natural selection is and why it's so important, let's first take a quick look at two other evolutionary concepts, descent with modification and the overarching idea of common descent. Descent with modification is the observable fact that when parents have children, those children often look and behave slightly different than their parents and slightly different than each other. They descend from their parents with modifications. The differences found in offspring are partially due to random genetic mutations. Common descent is the idea that all living things on Earth are related. They descended from a common ancestor. Through the gradual process of descent with modification over many, many generations, a single original species is thought to have given rise to all the life we see today. The common descent of all life on Earth is not a directly observable fact. We have no way of going back in time to watch it happen. Instead, common descent is a conclusion based on a massive collection of facts. Facts found independently in the study of fossils, genetics, comparative anatomy, mathematics, biochemistry, and species distribution. Because the evidence for common descent is so overwhelming, the concept has been around since ancient times. In the past, however, it was rejected by many philosophers and scientists for one main reason. You cannot get order and complexity from random chaos alone. The bodies and behaviors of living things are extremely complex and orderly. Descent with modification simply produces random variation. All through history, no one could explain how complex life arose from simple life through random variation until Charles Darwin discovered natural selection. Charles Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882, was a naturalist, someone who studies nature. At the start of his career, he traveled the world by ship, collecting and documenting plants and animals. During his travels, Darwin became very interested in the idea of common descent. He noticed that islands contain species of plants and animals unique to those islands. They can't be found anyplace else on Earth, but they often look and behave surprisingly similar to creatures found on nearby continents. Tortoises on the Galapagos Islands can be distinguished from those of Africa. Meanwhile, with the exception of size, they're almost identical to a species found nearby in South America. Darwin believed these similarities could be best explained through common descent. Long ago, a tortoise from the mainland may have drifted to the islands, possibly on a raft of storm debris, and once arriving, laid her eggs. Random changes caused by descent with modification over thousands of years eventually transformed the island creatures and the mainland creatures so much that they could no longer be considered the same species. This idea made good sense to Darwin, except for one thing. The island creatures he found weren't just randomly different from their mainland cousins, they were specially adapted for island life. The Galapagos is a collection of 18 main islands, many of which are home to tortoises. The larger islands have lots of grass and vegetation. Tortoises there grow extra heavy and have dome-like shells. Some of the smaller islands have very little grass, forcing the tortoises to feed on island cactus. The best cactus pads grow on the tops of these plants. Fortunately, tortoises on these islands are equipped with expanded front legs and saddle-like shells, allowing them to stretch their necks extra long to reach their food. It's almost as if these island creatures have been perfectly sculpted to survive within their unique environments. How did this sculpting take place? Random descent with modification alone could never do such a thing. Darwin drew upon his knowledge of selective breeding to answer this question. For thousands of years, farmers have been taking wild plants and animals, and through the process of selective breeding, have sculpted the original wild forms into new domestic forms, much better suited for human use and consumption. The process is slow but simple. If a single plant produces 100 seeds, most will grow to be nearly identical to the parent plant. A few, however, will be slightly different. Some variations will be undesirable, smaller size, bitter taste, vulnerability to disease, and so on. Other variations will be highly valued, thicker, sweeter leaves, for example. If a farmer only allows the best plants to reproduce and create seeds for the next crop, small positive changes will add up over multiple generations, eventually producing a dramatically superior vegetable. You might be surprised to hear that broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage are all just different breeds of a single type of weed commonly found along the shores of the English Channel. The evolution of this original plant into all the varieties we see today was carefully guided by different farmers around the world who simply selected for different traits. It's important to note that the farmer doesn't actually create anything. Random descent with modification creates new traits. The farmer simply chooses which of those new creations are allowed to reproduce and which are not. Darwin proposed that nature itself is also capable of selection. It may not have an intelligent brain like a farmer, but nature is an extremely dangerous place in which to live. There are germs which can kill you, animals that can eat you. You could die of heat exhaustion. You could die of exposure to the cold. When parents produce a variety of offspring, nature, simply by being difficult to survive in, decides which of those variations get to live and reproduce and which do not. Over multiple generations, creatures become more and more fit for survival and reproduction within their specific environments. Darwin called this process natural selection. Since Darwin first put forth his idea in the mid-1800s, natural selection has been studied and witnessed numerous times in nature and in the science lab. What started out as a mere idea is now officially an observable fact. Darwin's discovery has greatly expanded our understanding of the natural world. It's led to countless new breakthroughs, and it finally allowed scientists to seriously consider the idea of common descent. So to sum things up, what exactly is natural selection? Natural selection is the process by which random evolutionary changes are selected for by nature in a consistent, orderly, non-random way. Through the process of descent with modification, new traits are randomly produced. Nature then carefully decides which of those new traits to keep. Positive changes add up over multiple generations. Negative traits are quickly discarded. Through this simple, ongoing process, nature, even though it does not have a thinking mind, is capable of producing incredibly complex and beautiful creations. I'm John Perry, and that's natural selection stated clearly.
You see, we're back to the slides again.
Yes.
You can see that?
Yes, we
Okay.
are, yes.
All right. All right, let's, I'm going to go over some materials that are similar to what you just saw in the video. So to some extent, this is a review, but Darwin lived in the mid 1800s. He published his seminal work in 1859, a book called The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And it's important to make a distinction between the way scientists or people in general thought about life before Darwin and after Darwin. It's really quite simple. Before Darwin, people generally considered that species are stable. That is, each species on the planet was created just once and has not changed over time, which implies that extinction does not occur. Now, this ran into trouble, for example, when people started to discover skeletons of dinosaurs. Clearly, they were extinct. So it was hard to rationalize that. After Darwin and his theories of evolution based on natural selection, it became clear that species are not stable. They evolve, they change over time, and that all species are derived from a progenitor species, and that extinction is necessary. It eliminates species that no longer fit in their niche. So keep this in mind, that there was a dramatic change in philosophy of life between the thought prior to Darwin and after Darwin's theory. Now, there have been alternative visualizations of life forms. So one example here, Alexander Pope in the 1700s imagined a life as a ladder, starting with inanimate objects, then plants of various types, ending up at the top of the ladder with humans, and then above that was God. Darwin actually was the first to visualize life as a tree. But here's a little diagram taken from one of his notebooks, where he sketched out what resembles a tree. And what he was trying to show here is that life forms evolve one from another. And where he put little crossbars means extinction. So some life forms have become extinct, others continue to evolve. So more currently, we have trees, one of which I showed you in an earlier set. We have three domains of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And I won't go over all those again, except to remind you that archaea are relatively recent and are recently discovered based on molecular signatures. So most of us think of life and evolution as a tree, but it's really not. Life is really more like a web. And I illustrate that in this picture on the lower right, where we have a tree with species evolving from progenitor species in a vertical manner. That is, information is passed down from parents to progeny, parents to progeny, parents to progeny over evolutionary time. This is complicated, now we know, by the fact that genes are not only transferred vertically, but horizontally as well. It's called horizontal gene transfer. So completely unrelated organisms like bacteria and eukaryotes can exchange genes across species boundaries. So the evolution of life on Earth is still a hot topic. There's a lot of discussion going on among scientists about how it happened and where did life actually originate. And I'll come back to this point at the end of the talk. So mechanisms of evolution, contrasting hypotheses. In the upper left, you see an illustration of what you saw in the video. This bird likes the green beetles more than the orange ones. So it eats the green ones, and we end up going from a mixed population of green and orange to 100% orange based on the preference of the bird. Another hypothesis that has not really competed with Darwin's evolution was fostered mostly by a French man named Lamarck. It's called Lamarckian evolution. I'd just like to mention this so you're aware of it and know that it's not true. So according to Lamarck, if you consider giraffes, ancestral giraffes stretch their necks to reach foliage on tall trees. And as a result of stretching their necks got longer. And this trait, a longer neck, was inherited. And so that over time, this happened repeatedly until we end up with these giraffes with long necks. So the important thing here is that a phenotype, long necks, can be inherited. It's not true. Darwin, on the other hand, said that in any population there is genetic variation. So among ancestral giraffes, some had long necks and others not. Those with longer necks were able to reproduce more because they had access to more food. And so the ones with long necks became abundant, ones with short necks became extinct. So we end up with a population of giraffes with long necks. But do you see the distinction here between inherited traits and survival of the fittest based on variation?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, Darwin seemed more logical too.
Well, with hindsight, certainly it does seem logical, but prior to Darwin, nobody or very few people thought along these lines. And in fact, well, first let me reiterate what you saw in the video and emphasize a couple of points about how Darwin arrived at his conclusions. So the main thing that influenced his thinking was this voyage he took, 5 years on a ship. This is a drawing of the ship, HMS Beagle. Departed from England in 1831. It got back to England in 1836. You can see the route that the ship took, leaving from Plymouth in England, down the coast of Africa, across the Atlantic to the coast of South America, all the way down the coast, stopping repeatedly, up the north along the western coast of South America, till it got to the Galapagos. And this is where Darwin made some of his most important observations. The Galapagos are owned by Ecuador. It's a cluster of islands off the coast of Ecuador. There are 18 islands, and Darwin visited most of them. And he noticed the distinct isolation of populations. So it was important, critical to his observations, that he stopped at these islands, because what islands do is physically isolate populations. On a continent or on a large body of land, species can evolve, but they blend together, they merge, and it's not so obvious that they're distinct. And as you saw in the video, these turtles, in fact, Galapagos is the Spanish word for turtles. Darwin was very impressed by the turtles. On some islands, they're huge. In fact, Darwin described riding on the backs of some of these enormous turtles. An anecdote having to do with these turtles, the whaling vessels, once they were discovered, whalers always had a problem of providing fresh food. Turtles they could capture, put on a boat, and they'd live for many months or even years without eating. So when they needed fresh meat, they could simply harvest a turtle. And because of that, these large turtles almost became extinct. Fortunately, they didn't. But more important to Darwin than turtles were birds, in particular finches. What he noticed is that if you look in the upper right here, that on various islands, there were various different food sources. And that was absolutely correlated with the type of beak that the finches on that island had. So for islands where there were lots of small seeds, or large or small seeds, there were beaks that could crush seeds, either large beaks for large seeds or small beaks for smaller seeds. There were some beaks adapted to eating cactus, some eating other types of plants. There were some that were adapted for eating insects. And these were very distinctly associated with different islands. On the upper left, you see another illustration of the same thing. Here's a picture of Darwin's drawings of some of the turtles, which he was very impressed with. So he made these observations. He captured these birds, he preserved them, and he sent them back to England, where he studied them later and came up with this idea that these beak morphologies are due to evolution. And now we know that there's a genetic basis for these different beak sizes and shapes. And I give you 3 examples here, 3 different genes, BMP4, CAM, and ALX1. BMP4, differential expression of it results in variation of beak sizes and beak shapes. Calmodulin regulates beak growth, whereas ALX1 is a transcription factor which determines it determines which genes are on and which genes are off, and it affects the craniofacial development of birds. So all of these allelic differences occur on different islands. So one allele of BMP4 might be prevalent on one island and not on any others, whereas a different allele of it would be just the reverse. And this is just to emphasize the point that I've been making, the importance of islands, because they isolate phenotypes. So on this big island, one type of beak predominated, different from the beaks on another island and another island and another island. And because of the physical separation of the islands, the species on each island were discrete and distinct, easily identified. This is a phylogenetic tree based on ribosomal RNA sequences of the finches on the Galapagos Islands, all derived from a common ancestor which came from the South American mainland. long ago. And from that, as time went on, the various different beak sizes evolved, sizes and shapes. Here's an example of an observation, again with the beaks of finches, showing that natural selection can be evident in a very short time, in this case, just 2 years. So this was an observation made on one particular Galapagos island, Daphne Major. It turns out that that island had a drought in 1977, and it reduced the number of small seeds that plants produced. So many of the finches that had small beaks for eating small seeds starved because there were no small seeds and their beaks were not big enough to eat big seeds. So this caused an increase in the average beak size between 1976 and 1978. And in these two graphs, you see the data. Beak size, and you can see how it was measured, this distance. So beak size is plotted against the percentage of individuals having a beak of that size. And in 1976, the mean beak size was 9.5 millimeters. After this drought, 2 years later in 1978, the mean beak size was 10.2 millimeters, and that is statistically significant. So you see the point. The habitat changed, resulting in a change in diet, change in the food supply, and that change resulted in a change in the morphology of the birds. And that happened in just a period of 2 years. Now, despite the fact that most people, at least most people, including almost all scientists, accept Darwin's theories now, they weren't readily accepted in the 1800s when he first published his work. Most scientists dismissed evolution and natural selection based on the rationale that innovations can't possibly come into existence through many small steps. The turning point in the thinking, at least in the scientific world, came when they made observations of the peppered moth. So let me tell you about the peppered moth. Here are drawings of the peppered moth, the original population in England, shown with the blue line. Population after natural selection, shown by the red line. The legend here describes it. The light-colored peppered moths are better camouflaged against a pristine environment. Likewise, dark-colored moths are better camouflaged against a sooty environment. So as the Industrial Revolution in England progressed, the color of the moth population shifted from light to dark. So the Industrial Revolution caused the trunks of trees to darken from soot that accumulated. Dark moths were better camouflaged than lighter ones, and so the dark moths population increased. And so important to remember here that the predators of these moths are birds who like to pick them off the trunks of trees. Here you see actual pictures of peppered moth. Here is a light-colored moth on a green leaf. Here is a light-colored moth and a dark-colored moth on a sooty bark. And you can see that it's much easier to see the dark moth than the light one. Here again, there are two moths, a light one and a dark one on a dark trunk. Much easier to see the dark one. On this heavily sooted tree, the dark moth is almost invisible. The white moth is easy for birds to see. Again, shows the same thing here. Two moths on a light colored trunk. They're light colored, almost impossible to see. So it's easy to imagine how birds have trouble finding light colored moths without the contamination of soot. When soot contaminates the environment, then it's easy to see the light moths and almost impossible to see the dark ones. I have here on the upper right two different environments in England which selected for the different kinds of moths, different colors of moths. One is Dorset, which is it's a county on the southern coast of England. Its economy is based primarily on fishing, and it has clean air. The other, Manchester, located in the industrial heartland, its economy is based on heavy industry, a lot of pollution, at least in the 1800s. So that's what caused in Dorset, the original population was maintained, light colored moths, whereas in Manchester, the population shifted to dark colored moths. And this was actually demonstrated in an experiment, which I show you here, where the percent of moths remaining is plotted against moth generations. So the experiment started in an environment that had light colored tree bark. And a population of moths was released, which was half and half, 50% dark colored, 50% light colored. And then over time, the percentage of different colored moths was recorded. So after as little as 2 moth generations, there were more light moths than dark. Remember, this is on light colored tree bark. So it was easy for birds to see the dark ones, and their population decreased. More difficult to see the light colored ones, and their population increased. So this observation with the peppered moths was made in the 1800s in industrialized England. And this alone convinced most scientists that the evolution theory was valid. And now I'd like to switch to other organisms. So take, for example, bacteria, which are tiny, but they exist in populations also, and you can actually observe them evolving in a test tube. So for example, if we have a population of dividing bacteria, green colored, and during division, one bacterial cell undergoes a mutation that makes it antibiotic resistant. Now, if you change the environment by adding an antibiotic to the culture, now all the sensitive bacteria will die. Only the resistant one, which became resistant spontaneously, before the antibiotic was added. But now you change the environment, everything dies except the one that can survive in that environment. And you end up with a whole new population of bacteria that have evolved based on a single gene mutation. And now I'd like to show you another video, which I think is pretty impressive. You see that, Science News? Tell me if you can't.
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish,
Let's see
except
it.
that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands. At the base of each of these bands,
We can't see it.
normal.
Okay,
petri dish
thanks.
with different.
For letting me know. Can you see that?
So what we ended up building was basically
No.
No, we still got the other screen. The one from your slides.
Okay, what am I doing wrong here? Now do you see a black slide?
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands. At the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, of course, thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
you back to slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I find that video really interesting because it shows evolution in real time. In a matter of just a few days, these bacteria evolved whole new populations just based on severe environmental selection. I'd like to switch from evolution as such and point out that it's not the same as adaptation. So adaptation is a component of evolution, but it's not evolution. In adaptation, individuals adjust, whereas in evolution, populations adapt. And that's illustrated here with these two animals, an Arctic fox, which in summer is brown because it has a brown environment. In winter, it's white, so it's hard to see against the snow. Similarly, the Arctic ptarmigan, which is a type of pheasant, is brown colored in the summer when it has a brown environment, and it's pure white in the winter against the snow. So this is a change in phenotype, but it's not evolution based on natural selection, because the same individual can switch back and forth. It's not a hereditary change. So that, in other words, when the brown one switches to white, it doesn't remain white during the summer. Another example are chameleons, which can change colors. These are not evolutionary changes. They are adaptations based on guanine crystals in the skin, which cause them to form various different colors depending on the wavelength of light. And now I'd like to talk a little bit about the evolution of humans. We're all Africans. Humans evolved on this planet just once, and that evolution occurred in Africa. And whereas Homo sapiens, modern humans, evolved in Africa, so did a lot of relatives, also in the genus Homo, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo erectus, and a number of others, all of which are now extinct, except Homo sapiens. Now the Neanderthals evolved or migrated out of Africa about 400,000 years ago by traveling overland through Egypt, the Middle East, and then spread out over Northern Europe and Central Asia. The environment they encountered in the north was very different from what they had in Africa. This was during the ice ages, and they had to learn to adapt to live, to survive in a very harsh environment. So they acquired mutations that allowed them to exist and propagate in this harsh environment. So that's Neanderthals. Humans later evolved in Africa, and they did the same thing, except much later, about 60,000 years ago. So this is 340,000 years after the Neanderthals. Humans migrated out of the, now according to the same pathway. They, however, didn't stop. They eventually migrated throughout the entire, the landmass of the entire planet to every place on the planet. But there was a period of time when they coexisted with the Neanderthals. Well, humans had the same problem the Neanderthals did. They were adapted to the climate they found in Africa. They were unprepared for this harsh environment in Northern Europe. So they had a choice to make. They could either spend the next 400,000 years evolving to fit the climate, as the Neanderthals had done, or they could mate with the Neanderthals, thus borrowing their genes for adaptation to the European climate. And humans chose to do B. Now, how do we know all this? I've mentioned this man to you before, Svante Pääbo, who's an evolutionary biologist who specializes in the sequencing of DNA. In 2010, he sequenced the genomes of 3 Neanderthals obtained from bone fragments preserved in a cave in Croatia. Now, this was just 7 years after the first human genome was sequenced in 2003. So very quickly, Pääbo adapted the technology to sequence Neanderthals, which have been extinct for a long time. So how did he do it? PCR. You know about PCR, how it works. So if Pääbo could find even 1 molecule of Neanderthal DNA, he could amplify it with PCR and sequence it. And by doing that, he's put together complete genomes of different Neanderthal individuals. And I showed you this picture once before of this woman who is imagined from the DNA in her bones. The sequence indicated that she's inbred. Her father was the half-brother of her mother. And here are data. I also showed you this before, that different ethnic groups on Earth have different components, different percentages of Neanderthal DNA. So Africans have none. Other ethnicities have various amounts from 2 to 4%. I myself am 3.1%. So why don't Africans have any Neanderthal DNA? Well, it's because they existed in Africa at different times. So the Neanderthals left Africa and then evolved. And so they never interacted with humans.
Professor,
Yeah.
what exactly again was a Neanderthal?
Who are the Neanderthals?
Yeah,
They're a species of Homo.
so they're not human.
No. So here you see life-size models of Neanderthal as opposed to human at a museum in London. So you can see
The
that,
ones at the bottom?
yeah, at the bottom left. And here you see the skulls of a Neanderthal versus skull of a human.
And they're
So-
not human. They look like it.
They have a lot of characteristics, and they didn't survive. They're extinct now because once humans invaded their space, they could no longer compete.
Was that kind of like what they call cavemen?
Yeah, they lived in caves.
Okay, That's
Professor,
what they call them. Okay.
this is Alex, slightly off topic, but do we have a quiz on Wednesday?
No, there are no
Okay.
more quizzes. Wednesday, we'll have another class period. Then next Monday, we have a class discussion of your questions. And then test 3 will be a week from Wednesday on December 8th.
No more quizzes?
No more quizzes.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Professor.
Okay. All right, back to what humans and Neanderthals did. So I'd like to take you through an exercise in genetics, Mendelian inheritance. So imagine we're going back to where humans encountered Neanderthals in Europe. Neanderthals were adapted to the climate, humans were not. And so we now know that humans and Neanderthals mated. So consider the genetics of that. So if we have a Neanderthal and a human, they mate, and their progeny now have 50% human genes and 50% Neanderthal genes. Now they're going to mate. And if there's a backcross to a human, which has 100% human genes, the progeny of that mating will have 75% human genes and 25% Neanderthal genes. Now, if a human progeny, or I should say a progeny of that mating, mates again for another generation, again crossed to 100% human, now the progeny are 87% human, 12% Neanderthal. And after doing that a third time, the progeny are now 93% human, only 6% Neanderthal. And after one more generation, it's 96% human and 3% Neanderthal. And this is the range of Neanderthal DNA that we see in the human genome today. So you can see that in just 4 or 5 generations, we could go from the first mating between humans and Neanderthals to the genomes that we humans have today, even though the Neanderthals no longer exist. And so this could have happened in as little as 100 years. It probably took much longer than that, but it doesn't matter. The time, it's been a long time for that to happen. But the important point here is, why do we, after all this time, all these generations and matings among humans, still maintain 2 to 4% Neanderthal DNA? It must be because that DNA is important to us. Otherwise, we would have lost it rapidly, as we did through the first few generations. So does everybody see the point I'm trying to make here? Is that we know that humans and Neanderthals mated. And we know that now our genome is almost entirely human with a little bit of Neanderthal. And that happened simply by backcrossing to human parents.
Professor, I have 2 quick questions.
Uh-huh.
So the first one is how do they know how old, like, were the Neanderthal, how do you say it? Neanderthal?
Uh-huh.
How do they know how old were they, like, when?
There are various ways of dating fossils. For example, with isotopes of carbon. So it's fairly easy to get a pretty accurate indication of the age of a fossil just by carbon-14 dating.
Oh, okay. I think I know what it is.
Yeah, we talked about C14 dating back when we were talking about chemistry and isotopes. So isotopes decay at a certain rate, and carbon-14 is an isotope that decays at a certain rate all the time. But once an organism dies, it stops assimilating carbon-12, and its carbon-14 decays at a certain rate, and depending on how much of that is left determines how old it is.
Sorry, well, carbon-14 was like a radioactive isotope, right?
It's an isotope of carbon. Yeah, it's not radioactive.
Oh, it's not? Oh,
It has 2 extra neutrons.
oh, okay.
Okay, any more questions? So what Neanderthal genes are preserved in our current population? Well, fair skin. Africans have dark skin, a lot of melanin pigment. Europeans have light skin and freckles. Freckles are clusters of cells that overproduce melanin. which convert sunlight to vitamin D. And in northern climates where with weak sunlight, more access to melanin is needed. Keratin, humans have Neanderthal genes for production of keratin, and large eyes. Large eyes are required to enable clear vision in the weak sunlight of northern latitudes. So Neanderthals evolved them, and we still see evidence of that today. I showed you this picture before. Here's imagined morphology of a Neanderthal compared to a modern human, very similar. Skulls have some differences. Do you notice the heavy brow ridge in a Neanderthal skull? Some humans still have it. Similarly, this occipital bun, back of the skull, most humans don't have that, but some still do. So going forward, there's a new book published just this year speculating what's going to happen to Homo sapiens in the future. One thing for sure is that for long-term survival, we have to colonize space. And this book is projecting that by the year 2500, humans will be directing their own evolution by genome editing. And we know that that's possible using CRISPR. So this book describes 10 different phases that humans are going to go through. I won't describe them all now, but the point is that by the year 2500, humans will have unlimited possibilities through the use of controlling the genetic code and altering how molecules respond to stimuli. So just to give you an example of that, this example is radiation resistance. There's a type of animal called a tardigrade, which is very small, about 0.5 millimeter in size. It's aquatic, it's found in many different environments, and it's highly resistant to extreme environments. So it can tolerate high levels of radiation, temperature extremes, pressure extremes. It can survive without oxygen. It can dry out without dying, and it can survive for many years without eating. So in this particular experiment, a gene encoding radiation resistant, where these tardigrades are resistant to radiation, and a gene encoding a protein that conferred radiation resistance was transferred from a tardigrade to human cells in culture. These are not existing humans, they're simply human cells in culture. And now those cells are highly resistant to X-rays. So this is getting back to this Christopher Mason, who is projecting how humans are going to evolve in the next 500 years. One of the possibilities is to take genes that already exist in other organisms and transfer them into humans. This is just sheer speculation, certainly not something I'm advocating, but it's talking about what other people are thinking and what possibilities there might be. And now the last point I want to make is related to evolution, but it's kind of a peripheral issue. And that is that most eukaryotes are chimeras. That is, we're a mixture of different cell types. On the left here, the microbiome. Your body contains more bacterial cells than human cells. So a human body contains about 30 trillion human cells and about 38 trillion bacterial cells. So it's been speculated that if you took from your body, removed all of your human cells from your body, you would still look like yourself, just because of the bacterial cells that are still remaining there. So now, in addition to us having more bacterial cells in our bodies than we have human cells, we also have mitochondria, which are their own discrete entities. We have Neanderthal proteins, we have chimpanzee proteins, and we carry with us many viruses, most of which are harmless. And so our bodies and the bodies of most eukaryotes are chimeras composed of many different types of cell. And this leads me to the final point I want to make today, and that is you should be aware of this endosymbiosis hypothesis. Where did mitochondria and chloroplasts come from? And the hypothesis is that mitochondria and chloroplasts were once prokaryotes themselves. So at some point in the distant past, a prokaryotic cell took in bacteria. And these bacteria became dependent on the prokaryotic cell and became mitochondria of a eukaryotic cell. And the association was mutually beneficial. The eukaryotic cell provides protection and some nutrients. The mitochondria, or the prokaryotes that invaded the cell, provide energy. We've just spent a long time discussing respiration. Respiration goes on in mitochondria. Now the mitochondria, or I should say the bacteria that originally entered the cell, they've lost most of their DNA now. Mitochondria have a few genes, but not nearly enough to survive outside of the cell. Then later in evolutionary time, these eukaryotic cells with mitochondria assimilated cyanobacteria, which have chloroplasts. So now these cells became photosynthetic, and they gave rise to what we now know as plant cells. So in a plant cell, we have mitochondria. Animal cells also have mitochondria, essential for the production of energy. Plant cells, in addition, have what were formerly bacteria, but are now chloroplasts. And of course, we're entirely dependent. Life on Earth is entirely dependent on photosynthesis for the production of food. And finally, the last slide in this set is a summary of points that I think are major points that you should review when you study for the test. Are there any questions about the chimeric nature of bodies?
Yep.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm still confused. I don't understand because on this slide that you're showing, and it says the body contains more bacterial cells than the human cells, but the body is connected to. We're human. I don't get. Is you separated us, or I don't get that.
The human cells and bacterial cells are all mixed up together. So, for example, in your gut, you have hundreds of different types of bacteria to help you digest food.
Uh-huh.
On your skin, you have hundreds of different types of bacteria. In your mouth, you have hundreds of different types of bacteria.
Okay, I got you.
In every cavity of your body, you have many bacteria. And if you add them all up and look at the distribution of them, they're everywhere. And they are more numerous than your own cells.
Oh, that's not following. Okay. Maybe in my dreams it'll click, because right now that's still not making me understand. What happened?
Okay, anybody can add any clarity for Yolanda?
I lost it. Oh, there we go. Okay.
I have kind of a general question, which is, are we going to be talking more about the microbiome in the body, or is it kind of just what we have here right now?
Yeah, this is it. We don't have time
Yeah.
to go into it in more detail, or in the endosymbiosis hypothesis. They're massive topics in their own right.
Yeah, no worries. I was just wondering. I read a lot of books on it, so it's just one of my favorite
Yeah,
things.
well, I encourage you to read more, because there's a lot of information
Yeah.
about the microbiome and about endosymbiosis. Okay, anything else? We're out of time. So next time, we're going to talk about climate change. And then a week from today, you have an assignment which is due on Saturday, December 4th, where you'll submit your questions and things that you'd like to discuss in class next Monday. And this will be to help you prepare for test 3 and for the final exam.
So this stuff won't be on the test then?
Yes, everything that I'm discussing today and Wednesday will be included both on the test 3, and on the final exam.
Well, I definitely have some questions about that then. Okay.
Well, bring your questions to class a week from today, and we'll discuss them.
Okay. Yeah, and that little bug thing that you said that in the future, we're all gonna be like that or have the genetics like that. Yeah, I have more questions about this today's
Well,
class.
that's just to expand your mind and let you know that people are thinking about the long-term future of humans, and it's entirely speculation. Okay, anything else before we go? If not, I will end the session and see you all on Wednesday.